Everyone, thanks so much for coming. My name is Maura Gingrich, and I'm on the CUNY Law Housing Rights Project e-board. We're one of the co-sponsors of this event, along with the CUNY LG chapter and the National Lawyers Guild Housing and Homelessness Committee. And the Housing Rights Project is just a student project that we strive to facilitate awareness of and advocate for solutions to issues on the housing spectrum. And one of the ways that we do this is by generating awareness among CUNY law students and staff and trying to support established community efforts. So that's one of the reasons why we're so excited to host this event today. I want to introduce Alex Matak, who's a 3L at CUNY with a history of organizing and rabble-rousing, including helping to organize Canada's largest student strike against neoliberal austerity measures. Thrilled to share with you all that beginning this fall, she'll be working with RAP and the Law Center to launch the House Keys, Not Handcuffs Legal Defense Clinic project. Alex is going to introduce our panelists. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Maura. Can I get some head nods or thumbs up if you can hear me? Yeah, I love some waves. I got some smiles. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I think my mom is somewhere in the audience, so hi, Mom. It's so good that so many of you from across the country can join us to talk about this important, super important issue that is not spoken about enough. I am just going to jump right in. Actually, right before I introduce the panelists that you're going to hear from, just a few sort of housekeeping things. If all of you who are not panelists could keep your videos off, I know that it's not usually the Zoom norm, but this way, because we couldn't do it in a webinar format, this way we can make sure that we're really centering the panelists. And just, we're gonna keep you all muted. But if you're having questions that you want to be asking the panelists along the way, you can put those in the chat box. And specifically, if you can send them directly to me, I'm Alex. You'll see you can direct message me. That would be great. I'm going to be compiling them as we go for the question and answer period at the end. And if you have any other questions, you don't know what's happening, feel free to message me in there too. And so with that, I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to introduce you to our amazing panelists. So in no particular order, well, actually in the particular order of how you'll be hearing from them tonight, we're going to be hearing from Paul Bowden. He's the executive director of the Western Regional Advocacy Project, or RAP. Paul became homeless at the age of 16 and spent his life working, organizing, and advocating on behalf of homeless communities since then. He's been a social worker in a drop-in shelter and a supportive hotel program. He's been the executive director of San Francisco's Coalition on Homelessness for 16 years and the president of its board of directors for an additional 10 years. He's served as a board member of the National Coalition for Homelessness and the co-chair of its Civil Rights and Grassroots Organizing Workshop. And he's won a whole bunch of awards that he'd probably be embarrassed if I told you about, but yeah. Then we're going to be hearing from Tristia Bauman. Tristia is a senior attorney at the National Homelessness Law Center, sorry about that, where she combines litigation, legal education, and legislative advocacy strategies to prevent and end homelessness. Her work focuses on combating the criminalization of homelessness and advocating for laws that protect the civil and human rights of homeless people. Tristia began her career at the legal services of Greater Miami as a housing attorney, and later served for several years as an assistant public defender in Miami-Dade County. And Tristia, sorry I flubbed that one up so many times. Glad you're with us though. Coming next, you're going to hear from Lynn Lewis. Lynn is a community organizer, oral historian, and educator. She served as the executive director of Picture the Homeless for 17 years, where she was also the civil rights campaign organizer for many years and went on to found the Picture the Homeless Oral History Project. She's a founding member of Communities United for Police Reform, which successfully worked to pass the Community Safety Act, which you're going to hear about, the first local law prohibiting police profiling based on housing status here in New York City. Lynn's homeless organizing and advocacy date back to 1988 when she was among the founding members of the Jacksonville and Florida Coalition for the Homeless and served on the board of directors for the National Coalition for the Homeless. Lynn is an adjunct professor at the New School, serves as a consultant to grassroots organizations, and founded and organizes the Stop the Sweeps campaign here in New York. You guys are all, you have so many things on your belt. It's a mouthful, but I'm glad you're with us, Lynn. Marcus Moore, who I think is here, and if not, will hopefully be joining us later, is a board member and a leader of the civil rights and housing campaigns at Picture the Homeless, where he works on issues like community land trust, permanent housing solutions for people experiencing homelessness, and ending discriminatory policing. Known around town as the homeless poet, Marcus uplifts the experiences of vulnerable populations through artwork, crafts, and powerful poetry and scenes. And these days, Marcus is also bringing his unique organizing expertise to the Stop the Sweeps NYC campaign. So I really hope Marcus can make it because that sounds amazing. Next on the docket, we have Marika Diaz. She's the managing director of the Urban Justice Center's Safety Net Project and a public interest attorney whose work focuses on supporting community and organizing efforts and grassroots organizing groups, particularly in struggles around homelessness. Marika is a steering committee member of the Right to Counsel Coalition in NYC, a board member of the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project, and a movement lawyering trainer. Prior to joining the Safety Net Project, Marika served as the director of the Tenants' Right Coalition at Legal Services NYC, and before that as a managing attorney at Make the Road New York. And last but certainly not least, we have Barry Simon, going by Simon, a longtime homeless rights advocate and leader here in New York City. Simon is a coalition campaign leader in the sort of current battle against the MTA and is the named plaintiff in the recent lawsuit that the Urban Justice Center filed against the MTA on behalf of defendants like Simon, who have been repeatedly harassed and threatened with arrest by NYPD officers while using the subways for shelter or transportation. So it's an amazing panel. I just talked for way too long, but those are incredible people and we are not gonna hesitate any longer to get to them. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Paul, to give us your presentation.
Okay, can people see the screen?
Yes.
There, I did the shit. Hot damn. Welcome everybody. My name is Paul Bowden, and I am currently the director of the Western Regional Advocacy Project, which was created by a bunch of organizations back in 2005 to sort of serve as a hub around research. Like we joke that we're the ALEC of poor people groups, but to really like make a concerted effort to get us out of just talking about housed versus unhoused people and more into a human rights context to everything that we're doing. We're not going to just lift ourselves out of this oppression that we're all facing. We got to be working together to lift everybody out of this kind of oppression. And so we created this document that I'm going to go through real quick. I was asked to give a sort of history of how we got to this situation with massive fucking contemporary homelessness. And, you know, when we're putting together RAP, it's like, really, the last thing poor people need is another freaking coalition. Like, we need to have a new way of doing our shit and a way of being accountable to our local communities. So the shit that people are dealing with in Skid Row, in the Tenderloin, in New York, in Sacramento, like it's universal. You know, the neoliberal policies that we're living under since the Reagan Revolution, you know, are that if it ain't a commodity and you ain't wealthy, you have no right to it. And so we did this research project of looking at the advent of contemporary homelessness. And we saw the last time there was massive homelessness in 1937, the feds created what we call HUD today. And they created it with this mandate, remedy the unsafe and unsanitary housing conditions, and to make sure that it was affordable. In 1998, 16 years after we started opening shelters again, as part of the contract on America with Gingrich and Clinton and those guys, when welfare, you know, AFDC became temporary aid for needy families, as opposed to aid for families with dependent children. So that kind of mindset was what was being implemented. And at the same time, they've changed the mandate of what guides HUD and said they can't be accountable for even a majority of its citizens to have a decent place to live. So you see a trend towards commodification. You see the massive reduction. This slide's about 5 years old. The number of units has gone way up since then.
Hey, Paul, sorry to interrupt you, but we actually can't see your slides fully. I've been waiting for a time to step in. We're only seeing like a sliver of your slide. You want to try resharing your screen?
If you stop sharing and reshare, we might be able to fix it. Like stop share, start slideshow, and then reshare.
Okay. Well, damn, you guys missed some cool stuff.
Well, we're gonna.
Well, you're such a cool tech person. You know just what to say and how to navigate.
Yeah, I told you, I went to the same school you did. Can you see it now?
We got
it. That looks great. Yeah. Is it the first slide?
No, it's not.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have interrupted you earlier.
Well, and I'll just go quick. When I was saying this is the groups that created RAP, you know, that's them, and was showing just basically documenting. We have it very well documented about the changing the preamble and the guidelines that drive what HUD's priorities are supposed to be. You know, the number of units and the commodification of housing. I feel like people know this, but you start to look at these numbers when you take 600,000 units of project-based Section 8 and public housing off the market. That shit wasn't sitting empty. Those people are out in the street. Like, that's a recipe, and it's a pretty clear one. You know, and you look at the rural housing programs going from 38,000 units a year being built to 0. And it's been 0 since we did this chart. You know, that's how you create massive contemporary homelessness, is you wipe out housing opportunities and you wipe out units that had existed that are no longer there. And then you do shit like housing choice vouchers, where the choice is the landlord's choice, not the poor person's choice, because the landlord can take the voucher or not. And you see 40 to 60% of those vouchers being turned back in, and they say the client fucked up because they didn't find a place to live. You know, the client didn't create the racism and classism that exists in America, and the federal government isn't doing anything to address it. But when you talk about homeowners' housing subsidies, everybody who's entitled to that pays a mortgage and is entitled to a housing subsidy through the IRS gets it. There's no waiting list, there's no screening, there's no criteria except you're paying a mortgage, and you're paying interest on that mortgage, then you get the deduction. And we're talking now, it's up to around $140 billion a year with no budget that's argued over, no funding guidelines. Totally, this is a right that homeowners have, and they get it through the IRS, so they don't even have to determine in advance how much they're going to spend, because everybody entitled to it gets it. Poor people are not treated in the same manner, and it's strictly based on what benefits the economic system. Mortgage companies, real estate interests, construction companies benefit from this housing subsidy program. So therefore, it's God's gift to them, and it's economic stimulus. When poor people try to get a housing subsidy, it's charity. And they're strictly guidelines and strictly legislation that dictates these. Jonathan, can you get this fucking thing to move again? It's stalled out. So what we have seen as we look at the reductions in affordable housing funding, this is just in the Section 8 in the public housing program. But as we see this massive decline, you see a massive increase. This is just California, but those handcuffs represent laws that came onto the books over those periods of time that are used to criminalize the presence of unhoused community members. So that was the concrete response. And we have the same data for Colorado and Oregon, and it was exactly the same. And they did it in Florida and Connecticut and came up with the same information. So the reduction in federal assistance for affordable housing directly correlates to the massive increase in laws local governments are passing to criminalize the presence of people in the street that don't have a place to live. So we go out, we talk to almost 1,700 of those individuals in our community members, 82% harassed, cited, or arrested for sleeping, 77 for sitting or laying down, 75 for fucking standing still. Stand still is a criminal offense. Sitting down is a criminal offense. Sleeping is a criminal offense. Eating in public in most places is a criminal offense. If you can't do that, that's a sundown town. And it's everywhere. And more we're seeing this trend fencing people in, like they just did down in LA, and they do it in Denver all the time. This image in here is Denver in the middle. The one on the left is down in LA. And I think this other one is in Portland. Fencing people and corralling them and then issuing citations to them as they come out for was that they were sleeping, and thinking that the fences are going to mean they'll never be homeless again. This is a pattern in a practice with business improvement districts and local government. And we're seeking, and we have a bill that's going to have a hearing next week, but they keep messing with us on having the hearing, that simply responds to the outreach that was done to people. And the Right to Rest Act says anybody, not just homeless people, anybody standing still, sitting down, sleeping in public spaces in a non-obstructive manner cannot be criminalized by local ordinances. That's all the bill says. And we've run it 8 times in 3 states over the last 9 years. 8 times this bill has gotten its ass kicked. League of Cities, business improvement districts, they've all just freaked out that you're taking away tools we use to keep our communities safe. They're tools of oppression. And the fact that they freak out so viscerally, and this is not just one side of the aisle freaking out about this shit. This is an ingrained local government response to the fact that I can't use loitering to get rid of people. I can't use these laws to make sure that gay and lesbian members have sit-lie laws were originally started in San Francisco against gay and lesbian community members moving into the Castro district. You know, loitering, sitting, sleeping, like those are not criminal offenses. And we're so reliant on jails and police harassment and intimidation and private security thugs. We're so reliant on that as the tool that local governments use to ignore, get rid of, and really dehumanize the issues of poverty and racism in America. And if we can make them disappear, then we don't have a homeless problem. If we don't have any Black people in our community, nobody can call us racist. If we don't let any immigrants in, we're not being, fucking racist in our policies. It's not true. It is racist. Making people disappear is an incredibly brutal process. To call it a sweep makes it sound so benign. It's not a sweep. It's an eviction. It's a mislocation. It's a getting rid of human beings. And that's the part that we feel like when we address these issues, we need to have that in our DNA. That this is about what is a human life entitled to, and how is a human being entitled to be treated for merely being in our community. Instead of welcome people with open arms, we use cops and thugs and bullshit in order to get rid of them. And so we're building power. We're writing our own legislation based on accountable street outreach to community members and reflecting what they've said to us. And the order is just freaking beautiful. and it's state labor programs, and it's BLM, and it's other community groups, and it's rural, it's urban. Like when you start talking about treating people as decent human beings, because that's what we are, you can really do some powerful organizing. And simultaneous to that organizing is defending the people that are currently being oppressed and building in legal defense structures so that as the oppression is playing out, it was one of the things that struck me in the 90s with welfare reform was the people that were actually on welfare were supposed to turn up at strategic times and say just the right thing on talking points that were written and given to them. And of course we got our asses kicked. We got to build our power as if we're all equal, and everything we all bring to the table is of value. You don't bring people like me when I was in the street or other people into the process when it's time to have somebody speak so that you look legitimate. You do the goddamn organizing from the street level up, and you build power that way. Thank you.
Wow, awesome.
Right on.
Wow, you're the man.
Thanks for that, Paul, and thanks for pivoting while we had that technical difficulty. Tristia, I think we're going over to you next. And so everyone knows, we're going to be sharing those slides that Paul just showed you and a bunch of other materials from all the panelists today in a Dropbox with you just after their presentation. So if you're more, you'll get it.
Thank you, Paul. I think that was the perfect intro, and I'm going to, pick up from where Paul left off. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. And you can all hear me okay? Great.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
my name is Tristia Bauman. I'm a senior attorney at the National Homelessness Law Center. And a few themes that I want to pick up on that Paul mentioned. What we are seeing is use of tools of oppression. And I think it's really important that we don't pretend that they affect everyone equally. They don't. They are uniquely racist tools that have been used to create and perpetuate racial inequity, disability inequity, LGBTQ oppression. Marginalized people are treated differently under the law, and the criminal law is certainly not an exception at all to that. So I think as we think about overlapping systems, it's really important to remember who is being primarily affected. Some of these slides, the first few slides, and I'm going to go through all of these slides pretty quickly, are based on 2019 data. All of this is getting worse. Just so we're all clear, it's already the case that the unhoused population is grossly disproportionately Black and brown, and that is expected to become significantly worse on a scale that perhaps we've never seen before in this country as a result of the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just again, the 2019 rates, and you can see gross disproportionality across groups. In the unhoused population, around 40% of unhoused people in this country are Black, even though they make up 13% of the general population. Groups like Pacific Islanders, of which I am one, are homeless at rates of 6 times that of white people in this country. So this is very much a racial equity issue, and generally an equity issue, and pushing back on laws that criminalize homelessness is important to any equity work that we're doing. And there's a lot of attention paid to equity, thankfully now, but it's important that we don't miss how criminalization of homelessness and presence in public space factors into that larger movement. Again, this is based on 2019 data, where 1/3 of people experiencing homelessness in this country sleep outside. That is now over half. So based on 2020 data, over half of all people that have been counted as being unhoused in this country are sleeping outside in tents, in vehicles, and other places that are not housing and not meant for long-term human habitation. The Law Center has tracked 187 cities across the country since 2006. And another theme that Paul mentioned, this is not a one side of the aisle problem. Regardless of your political party, you have blood on your hands as it relates to criminalization of homelessness, because cities across the country, urban, rural, run by Democrats, run by Republicans, they increasingly enacting and enforcing laws that have the effect of criminally punishing or civilly punishing people for engaging in universal and unavoidable survival behaviors in public space. So a couple of the 2% of cities that we have tracked prohibit camping outside, broadly defined. In many places, it can include merely sleeping outside. Just the act of falling asleep can be punished. It can also include related and equally innocent activities like sitting with your backpack, for example, can be considered camping, along with the erection of certain structures. That has grown, the percentage of cities that punish that behavior, that survival act, have grown across the country every time that we study these laws. So every time we release a report since 2006, these laws have grown, and now in around 3/4 of the country,
Excuse me?
surviving is illegal. Same thing with other types of resting activities. I'm just going to name a few here. Over half of cities restrict sitting and lying down, just those acts of sitting and lying down. We know that those are unavoidable resting acts. We also know that these laws are not enforced universally against all people who sit or lie down. They're used as tools of exclusion to push people who are complained about, visibly poor people, from public space. And they are a powerful tool for doing that. To great harm to all people, certainly the people who are at the tail end of punishment, as well as undermining our public safety, undermining public health, being a very expensive proposition, and generally harming the quality of life for all community members. We also know that one of the fastest growing category of laws punishing unhoused people are laws that punish people for sheltering in their own vehicles. Even if those vehicles are owned by the people, they're lawfully registered, people have insurance, and they're lawfully parked, they still may be subject to criminal penalty and be arrested and jailed for using their own property to protect themselves from the outdoor elements. And that is the fastest growing category of criminalization law. And notably, it affects the fastest growing population of unhoused people in the Western United States. That's people who seek out shelter in their vehicles. I'm showing these two images, and I'm also going to take a moment to ask my son to please leave the room, please. Yes, you can go watch videos. Thank you. Bronson, I can't. Okay, we can talk about that later. Thank you. Okay, so these two images, apologize for that. These two images show activities that I'm going to guess are familiar as a result of the change in policies and the disinvestment by the federal government. This looks like a common urban landscape that a lot of you are familiar with, and people who are on this call, a lot of you have grown up with. I mean, this is what appears normal. And these activities, just existing and attempting to shelter yourself, even in the most possible rudimentary way, without obstructing the sidewalk, without conditions, can be subject to punishment under a large number of laws. The unlawful camping bans that we talked about, sit-lie bans. This also is considered disorderly conduct in many cities. It can be considered unlawful obstruction, even though you can see people are able to walk by. This can be considered trespass, which results in bans, sometimes lengthy, years-long bans from public space. And also people are punished for unlawful property storage. And this is just a handful of the types of laws that these behaviors that we see that are unavoidable, anybody outside would have to engage in, can be criminally punished. So the accumulation of enforcement results in people without housing being 11 times more likely than housed people to go to jail. We also know that people exiting from carceral settings, jails and prisons, are 10 times more likely to experience homelessness. So it is a very vicious cycle that self-perpetuates. And again, it is not colorblind. It absolutely disproportionately impacts people of color. This is not to say that every community isn't harmed. We all are harmed by it, but it's important to always keep that in mind. Enforcement takes a lot of different shapes: arrest and incarceration, fines and fees that can result in warrants and eventual arrest and incarceration, move along orders that often comes with property loss, or orders to stay away from public space, either a stay away order itself or a trespass ban, which again, can result in very lengthy periods of exclusion from the public space where you received the punishment, as well as other related public space. For example, it's not uncommon for a trespass ban to apply to, for example, a park where somebody was found unlawfully camping, as well as all public parks within the city or the county, depending on the enforcement entity. So, that essentially creates no zones where people can, or zones of exclusion where people cannot exist without being subject to additional criminal penalty. And the defenses for those types of crimes are extremely limited, despite the innocence in the activities inherent in them. Also, property loss, that's a matter of life and death. It's inherently traumatizing at minimum to routinely lose property. And there is a great expense that all of us pay as taxpayers for the harm that's perpetuated through the sweeps activity and the routine property loss. And all of this is getting worse, not only because governments are enacting more and more of these types of laws and enforcing them aggressively and in discriminatory ways, but also because increasingly we're seeing the privatization of public space and more private entities, business improvement district security personnel, or other private security forces enforce these same types of laws. Now, what we normally think about and what folks in law school are learning about is that if you are subject to some form of criminal penalty, we all have a right to representation. It's guaranteed in the Constitution. And so at minimum, your defenses can be raised by your legal representative. But the reality is the majority of people who are charged with those types of crimes will never have meaningful contact with an attorney. Maybe it's because a public defender is never appointed, because the punishment is not, at least initially, criminal in nature, or because the punishment is not one that would initially come with any risk of incarceration, or because at first appearance, even if a public defender is appointed or some other counsel might be appointed, the case is resolved at first appearance. So there's no opportunity to raise defenses. And even if there were an opportunity to opt out of that in exchange for a plea to get out and just accept credit for time served so that they don't have to wait months to have their first hearing where they can raise the meritorious defenses that are available to them. So what that means is there is essentially a conviction mill that is running through our criminal justice system where people who are subject to severe penalties that can be barriers to them ever exiting homelessness are routinely imposed and done without ever having access to counsel. So what does that mean for justice? That means really there's no access to justice for a lot of unhoused people who are increasingly the targets punishing survival activities in public space. And that's where you come in. And that's where legal defense clinics come in. There is a gross unmet need for legal representation of unhoused people that is not being met by the traditional public defender system. This is not to say anything negative about public defenders. I'm a former public defender. I love public defenders. Those offices are not covering a lot of these cases. Legal services and legal aid offices, also great allies, are not covering a lot of these cases. This is just purely an unmet need. Even when you look at what legal clinics, law schools can fill gaps. Are they filling this gap? They're not. They're not. There is really very little that's being done to address this massive legal need. And it's a shame on a lot of different levels, including that there are meritorious defenses to these cases that can result in the cases being dismissed, that can result in the trespass bans being invalidated, or that people can still travel to the locations where they need to travel. There also are available claims to push back on these oppressive systems of enforcement and to get these laws repealed or prohibited from being enforced under First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Eighth Amendment, 14th Amendment claims, just to name a few, as well as state laws and federal statutory laws. But these cases are not being brought for a lot of different reasons. I know I've got just a kind of a final moment here. So I'll say it's as a result of this increasing criminalization of homelessness and the unmet need for legal representation and how that relates to building power in communities, which, as Paul said, is the only way that we're ever going to change the system of oppression. The RAP and the Law Center have partnered together to develop with the RAP members a legal defense clinic concept that is aimed at providing that frontline legal defense in an environment that is controlled by the organizing entity. So people are able to go to spaces where they're comfortable, where they are organizing with others to not only build power for a number of different reasons, but also to receive access to the legal representation that they're not getting. That is the first benefit that a legal defense clinic can provide. It also can help bolster and strengthen and result in more successful impact litigation in civil cases. So the concept that has been developed by RAP and the Law Center contemplates not only meeting that unmet legal need in direct defense, but also data accumulation so that you can look and see what are the patterns of rights violations that are taking place in my community. That will inform the litigation strategies. That provides the factual basis for your litigation, which will result in better outcomes, meaning wins, but also better remedies, really meaningful remedies that address the true needs of the community. All of that builds power, and all of that can lend itself well to policy advocacy and other forms of advocacy as well. We have a concept paper, and we're so excited that Alex is able to join us. She's the Equal Justice Works Fellow who's going to be helping to build that concept out. So thank you all for hearing us out, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tristia. That was incredible. Thanks for the shameless plug. And now we're going to turn it over to Lynn. And I think, unfortunately, Marcus didn't make it. So, Lynn, it's all yours.
Okay. While I'm getting this together, I want to really thank everyone for the invitation. And this is kind of a long PowerPoint, but I won't go through every slide, and it's already been shared, so you'll have access to all of it. And so basically, I want to talk about state violence through laws, policies, and practices with the actual goal of removing visibly homeless folks from public view, and that this is rooted in broken windows policing and earlier historic forms of abusive and racist police, but also that there are efforts by homeless people to push back and assert their rights on an individual and collective level through community organizing that have actually won some things. And there are ways that legal workers and allies have supported these efforts within the context of a homeless-led organizing campaign. And that one of the things that we need to do always is understand the difference between a legal strategy and a political strategy that can happen actually simultaneously. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So the criminalization of homeless folks is about who has the right to public space, and are poor people actually members of the public? And as we mentioned earlier, race plays a huge role in this. And so the way that we see this show up in New York is kind of in these three buckets: selective enforcement of quality of life violations, where police have the discretion equals discrimination to issue a ticket, to tell you don't worry about it, don't do it again, to arrest you for non-criminal violations, which under Mayor Giuliani was kind of codified in this quality of life violation category. So disorderly conduct, you can get arrested. Aggressive panhandling, trespassing, or they can convert into warrants. So if it initially wasn't an arrest and just a ticket and you can't afford to pay for it, it becomes a warrant. So that's selective enforcement. Move along orders are also selective. The police are not going to walk up to some tourists and say, move along, I don't want to see you here when I come back around the corner. And as Tristia mentioned, it can also involve property destruction and extra legal definitions that we'll get into, where they just make shit up, like hotspots is a legal or extra legal category in New York now, and we'll talk about that, and encampments and sweeps. And I'm going to play a recording. Hopefully, there we go. if it will let me, no? Okay, well, strategies to offend the civil rights of homeless New Yorkers within the context of homeless-led organizing always means using multiple tactics to build power. So outreach and issue identification. What matters most to homeless folks isn't necessarily what, if you're not homeless in that area, you might not necessarily think that that's the priority. So we need to listen to folks that are going through it and support folks' collective analysis, collective action. So it's one thing to talk to a whole bunch of different people and find out what are the common threads that people mention. And it's another thing for folks to come together and decide together what's important and what's a solution to the problem. Documentation, and this is where legal support can often be really crucial, because knowing what questions to ask, for example, to build up that body of evidence. Education about laws and policies, as well as organizing strategy, visibility and representation to shift stigma, stereotypes, and assert homeless leadership. Direct action and civil disobedience, shifting narratives through media work and alliances, which means basically linking with other groups fighting police abuse. In our case in New York, we joined forces with what eventually became Communities United for Police Reform, which is made up of a bunch of different grassroots groups that are impacted by police violence, legal representation and advice, and changing laws and/or enforcement, which means legal defense for individuals and larger kind of impact lawsuits to change laws and policies. Anthony Williams is a co-founder of Picture the Homeless. And as he says, it's important for homeless people to see other homeless people doing the work. Won't read all of this for y'all, but Picture the Homeless really utilized representation as a strategy to build leadership and also to send a message that homeless folks don't need to be spoken for. And so in this case, Nikita Price is the former civil rights organizer at Picture the Homeless, supporting Alethea, who's going to speak on behalf of Picture the Homeless. Resistance art. So we have a pop-ed street theater. We have delivering a ticket to the police commissioner for disorderly conduct, and Know Your Rights mural in Harlem. Bronx Die-In that kicked off 15 Days of Rage. We painted our hands and made bloody hands, and then we infiltrated the Manhattan Institute offices and taped bloody hands all over their walls with the names of people killed by the police. Our Canners campaign, building momentum for the New York State Attorney General to enforce the bottle bill to benefit canners. We combined direct action with gathering affidavits from canners. So the Attorney General's office didn't have access to canners as canners themselves did. Understanding what the bottle bill, what rights that provided folks, media work, and building resistance relationships. So when you engage in resistance, you build relationships with the other people that are resisting with you. I have a very long timeline, partial timeline of homeless civil rights organizing in New York City. And the reason that I have some of this stuff here is because, for example, the National Union of the Homeless, 1,200 people, 1986, founded the New York chapter, Tompkins Square Park, Resistance. Some of the people that were in those spaces became members of Picture the Homeless, became staff of Picture the Homeless, became board members of Picture the Homeless. So work that we do now shows up later in the future, right, in different ways. Mayor Bloomberg, his first press conference was announcing a new war on public pests. So you see panhandlers, prostitution, public urination, and number 7 is homeless. Really important lawsuit that Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church filed against the city because police started arresting homeless people off the church steps. They sued, they won when Giuliani was mayor. When Bloomberg came in, he upped it, and the church won again. Because Bloomberg, upon entering the office of mayor, just laid out the straight up war on homeless people, Picture the Homeless sued the city of New York for selective enforcement of quality laws. They settled out of court. We want a policy change that, as you can imagine, they're often non-enforceable. But we learned from that. And so from that work, a lot of other things happen. You build visibility, you build allies, you build leadership within your group. And one of the things that we did where we received a lot of legal support was creating Know Your Rights materials. And so since 2005, we've had sidewalk legal clinics, legal clinic at a soup kitchen. And here's a picture of Marcus anyway. Marcus is a trainer, a Know Your Rights trainer. Many members of Picture the Homeless became trainers. And so we have a train the trainer, train here, all members of Picture the Homeless. We launched a campaign to end the use of disorderly conduct. With attorneys, became very difficult, we found, to sue on the basis of people being targeted because they were homeless, because the tickets that people were getting didn't say their homeless status on them. But all of that work, what it did was led to us joining this emerging alliance of anti-police violence organizations to prioritize ending custodial arrests for summonses. And that also ended up building relationships with some attorneys who took on those cases as individuals, individual folks' cases. In 2013, we secured passage of the Community Safety Act. And it's the first bill in the country to explicitly name housing status as a protected class. We forced the MTA and Bratton's NYPD. He came back, Bratton Part 2, under Bill de Blasio, to point. Now it's a Democrat hiring Bratton. And his first act was to say he was going to purge the MTA of homeless people. Our hashtag was I paid my fare. In 2015, and you see the links here, so there's links to articles, there's links to the actual lawsuits filed. There's a link here to a video of Floyd Parks talking about his experience. This was what they would call now an encampment, a group of homeless folks seeking shelter out of the rain under an overhang. Their belongings were destroyed by a joint effort between Department of Sanitation and the NYPD. And we filed a lawsuit because the attorney got surveillance footage from a bodega camera, security camera, that proved that they kicked folks awake and throw their stuff in the garbage in the truck. And a month later, the NYPD issues a finest message creating a new definition of persons, hotspots. So they define encampments as outdoor locations with a visible structure where 2 or more individuals are gathered. Hotspots are outdoor locations where 2 or more individuals are gathered without a structure. So if we were all in this thing physically together and after we're like, hey, you want to go get a coffee, Tristia? And Tristia's like, yeah, let's go. We're a hotspot. If we're homeless, we'd be a hotspot. So if you insert any other group of people in that sentence, there would be an uproar. And so in 2016, we filed a complaint, the first complaint against the NYPD through the New York City Human Rights Commission, because that's where the Community Safety Act kind of lives, the profiling bill, because federal civil rights law does not include housing status as protected category, but New York City human rights law does. And so the link to the suit is there. And then in 2019, I believe it was, maybe 18, the Safer New York Act was introduced at the state level because we wanted to stop the police from having the discretion to arrest people for non-criminal offenses. And so that's the bill number there at the bottom. And so Stop the Sweeps was formed. Several of us folks came together at the invitation of RAP, said, you know, what are y'all doing over there, East Coast? Get on this. And so in solidarity and coordination with RAP and 10 other US cities, right now the focus is using surveys to document sweeps and elicit input from homeless folks about the impact as well as what other issues are priorities for them, and update and distribute Know Your Rights materials. In 2021, the Urban Justice Center filed a lawsuit against the MTA. You'll hear about that. But the current state of sweeps in New York is escalating. And mutual aid and neighborhood-based organizing also kind of started bubbling up, right? It's not just Stop the Sweeps to support their unhoused neighbors sleeping in public space. Informal networks evolved. So you have folks creating sweeps trackers, documenting, attending Stop the Sweeps survey trainings, building resistance relationships between housed and unhoused people, and confronting the Department of Homeless Services. In between March and December of 2020, New York City performed 1,077, they use even try to use a nicer word, cleanups, and we can think about things like slum clearance and urban removal or Negro removal or blight cleanups, but they're actually, it's state violence used to remove people that people in government and property owners often don't want to see. And it involves confiscation and destruction of property, harassment and humiliation, coercion to enter shelter during COVID, which is the last thing you want to do is be in a congregate setting. And outreach workers in New York are instructed to not provide hand sanitizer or other items to assist folks to be safe on the streets to force them into shelter. The Times reported last month, right? And then de Blasio just announced the other day that the city is going to hire 10,000 people to for this new operation, New York City Cleanup Corps. So, you know, 10,000 people could be hired to fix up a bunch of vacant buildings that they're sitting on so that people have housing, but they choose to do this. And there are lots of ways to get involved. I'm super excited about the possibility that there's a legal clinic or effort because right now people really have nowhere to go, as Tristia said, and that is very much the case in New York. And these are some of the things that are happening now, either through Stop the Sweeps or these other networks that we're moving towards better coordination. I have our email sweeps at the bottom. And I hope I didn't talk too fast, but the PowerPoint in case I did.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Yeah, I'm excited to look back over these slides because they're so rich with information. So thank you for that. Just a reminder to everyone listening or watching, if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to send them to me in direct message and put them in this chat. I'm going to be collecting them for everyone at the end of their presentations. And we will also be sending at the end of the presentations before the Q&A a link to the Dropbox. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to you, Simon and Marika.
Great, thank you. Simon, I'm just going to ask you to unmute. So let me just try and make that happen first. Oh, you got it. Great.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you. Yes, those were great presentations, and thank you, everyone. And you know, I think we're happy to be here, and we're going to be talking about the case that Lynn just alluded to, that we against the MTA, relating to anti-homeless rules that they promulgated last year. And so, you know, honestly, we don't have any sort of PowerPoint presentations, so I think we would love to see faces. If folks want to go back on camera now, would be great to see you all, and you know, we're really happy that you're all here this afternoon. So please definitely feel free to you know, just light up the screen, I guess. Yay. So I'm going to hand it over to what we're going to do is Simon is going to talk us through actually like the legal claims that we made in our case. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach, sort of our you know, litigation approach to the work and how we see it as fitting in with kind of movement work around these issues. So Simon, if it's okay, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick us off.
Sure.
Cool.
Sure. Okay, my name is Barry Simon, and essentially with this action, we are making 8 claims. The first 5 of them are administrative law claims, claims that the MTA's process for making the rules did not follow the law. And the final 3 are claims that essentially deal with race and disability. So right now I'm gonna go through the first 5 administrative claims. 1, the MTA stated a purpose necessity for the rules that was pretextual. That is, in the remaking, they said they were making the rules to prevent COVID transmission, But in the press, they gave their honest reasons for making rules, which were to stop the presence of homeless people in the subway system. That is 1. The second one, number 2, the MTA failed to provide a scientific study to show that the rules would, in fact, prevent COVID transmission. And thirdly, the MTA failed to show there was still a need for the rules when they made them permanent. A lot changed between the time they announced the rules and then eventually made them permanent. The MTA did address that. Fourthly, the MTA failed to assess the cost of these rules to homeless folks or people, as it were. And fifthly, the MTA failed to consider if there was a less harmful way to achieve their goals. They didn't look into whether they could do this in a way that would be burdening homeless folks less. Now, these first 5 are the administrative claims that we're making. I'm now about to get into the discrimination claims. But first, I'm going to preface it by saying discrimination claims, there are more people of color and people with disabilities in the homeless population than there are in the general population. Therefore, the rules impact people of color and people with disabilities disproportionately, and that is a form of discrimination. We made this claim under 3 different laws. These are the final 3 points that were made in the legal action. 1, New York City's discrimination laws. 2, New York State discrimination law. And 3, New York State civil rights law. So all of these 8 essentially are the basis for our lawsuit against the MTA. Is there any more elaboration necessary?
Well, I think we're going to come back to you in a little bit. But yeah, feel free to add anything on if you want to, Simon, at this point. If not, I'll give a little more information as well.
Okay, well then all I'm going to say about it is that with these 8 points that we are making as our complaint in the legal action, essentially what we want, what we're essentially looking for, is for them to stop doing what they're doing. We're not per se looking to get into a whole legal thing with them. Our purpose for doing it is that we want them to stop doing what they're doing because of how we, as well as myself, from personal experience, see how it affects and impacts homeless people, particularly persons of disabilities, as well as Black and brown people. And there it is.
Well, thank you, Simon, for taking us through that. And I should say, you know, one thing for folks who aren't familiar. So, you know, and there actually are a bunch of folks on this call who are working with us on this. So I want to just recognize them. You know, I see that Jenny is with us, who, you know, actually had the original idea for the case and brought it to us. And Eric Wax from our office is here, who's working on it, and you know, others. So yeah, it definitely has taken a team to sort of bring this together. And so really, you know, what we're kind of grappling with are rules that kind of were put forth, you know, using the moment of COVID really as a pretext to sort of say, you know, we need to protect public health and safety, we need to stop COVID transmission. But in actual fact were rules that were clearly targeting homeless folks, and actually advancing an agenda that the MTA has had for a very long time, well before COVID. And they were really sort of opportunistically using that moment of COVID to do this. And I think, you know, we've seen this in not just this arena, but in other ways. And it you know, I think was something we really anticipated, you know, for a lot of us anticipated in movement spaces, that authorities, that people with power, that governments would try to use that moment of crisis to sort of advance their agenda. And you know, this was a you know, a very sort of, you know, good example of that, I think. And so, you know, what the MTA was saying is, you know, we need to make this series of rules because we're in this state of emergency, and COVID transmission is a real challenge right now, and we've got to protect people. And so what they did was they, you know, set forth a series of rules that they initially promulgated as an emergency set of rules, and then later they went ahead and made them permanent. And, you know, they did so in a way, you know, that was not so unusual for them, honestly, in the sense that they used the sort of the legal processes, but the legal processes are firstly, very deficient, right? Like they don't really give the public good notice and kind of meaningful notice of what's going on behind the scenes. And then suddenly, before people know it, there's a new rule. And then they're directly being targeted by that new rule, and that's being enforced and imposed on them in a very physical way. And so, and, you know, violent way. And so, you know, and that's precisely what happened here. And so the key sort of, you know, the key components of the rules that we have, you know, emphasized in our case, which aren't the whole of the rules, to be honest. Like we were, to be frank about it, kind of scrambling to get this case in the door before we hit our limitations deadline for filing it. So there may be aspects of the rules that we didn't fully get to explore, but we you know, we targeted as much as we could. And what we focused on were a rule that prohibits people being in the fare paying area of the subway system for more than an hour. And, you know, and the MTA, as Simon was saying, they didn't advance any particular reasons or good, you know, medical or scientific basis for why this rule would help. They didn't say, well, you know, if you're in for 59 minutes, it's okay, you transmit less COVID, but if you're in for an hour, well, then that's the moment where it all goes awry. You know, they weren't able to advance anything like that because they didn't have any real basis for this. And in fact, you know, in their response to our papers, have kind of made that clear. They've said, you know, basically, if you're in there for an hour, well, then you're not really doing transit, you're doing something else. And for whatever reason, they've determined that that's like the threshold, you know, where they've decided you're there for some other reason. And in this case, you know, we very firmly believe, because this is what they said in public, that the other reason they're most concerned about is because you're a person who's homeless and you're either taking shelter in the subway system or utilizing it for some other purpose. And that was really, you know, one of the key things about our case in some ways, was that the MTA kind of made the case for us, because at the same time that they passed all these rules, you know, we had the governor coming out and making a lot of really cruel, inhumane, anti-homeless statements. We had our own mayor coming out and making the same kinds of cruel, inhumane statements. And we had, you know, and really honestly whipping up kind of anti-homeless sentiment in the public as well. And then we had the MTA kind of coming out and trying to capitulate to those sentiments by saying, well, no worries, we're doing something about this. And look, here we've made these rules. And these rules are going to help us eliminate the presence of homeless folks in the subway. And so while on the legal side, they're saying these rules are about COVID, they wrote op-eds and did interviews in the press. And, you know, like literally the head of the MTA wrote his own press saying, yes, this is what we're doing about homelessness. And so, you know, they kind of, the fact that all of this was kind of a facade, they made it very clear themselves through their own press work. You know, another rule that we're targeting is a rule around people not being able to have carts of a certain size in the subway system. And then the final one that we really targeted was a rule that made it permissible for the MTA and their agents to remove people from the system, the subway system, when they took trains out of service. And, you know, where we really saw this, you know, having the most impact and the most sort of violent and detrimental impact on homeless folks was the subway closures at night. Where, you know, under the sort of the guise of kind of needing to clean the subways and minimize subway usage at night, they would take trains out of service and forcibly eject homeless folks from the subway system, oftentimes at lines where people didn't really have any points of navigation or places to go or people to connect with for support or shelter in those places. But then also it was being used when they were taking trains out of service, you know, just in the middle of the day, honestly. And what, you know, I think, Simon, you could speak to is some of the experiences of what would happen in those moments. And I might hand it over to you in just a minute to do that. But before I do, you know, just to say, you know, we brought this case with a movement lawyering approach. We did not necessarily bring this case. The question of whether we would win this case was not our primary consideration. Brought this case knowing that there were organizing efforts happening to combat these rules, both legislative organizing and direct action organizing and other kinds of coalition organizing. And so really for us, what bringing this case was about was to increase the pressure on the MTA around these rules, to expose the real reasons and systems at play here, to reveal the logic of the system and to reveal kind of that actually, you know, you're pretending that this is about COVID, but really this is about targeting homeless folks. And so to expose kind of those lies and to really, you know, do media work and different things around the case that could contribute to the organizing, the grassroots organizing efforts that are happening around the rules. You know, obviously we hope that we'll win the case and we feel like we have a strong case, but that's not, you know, the only rationale behind bringing the case. We see it as a strategic tool within the context of these organizing efforts. And so I don't know, I think I'll just quickly hand it over to you, Simon, to have the last word and tell us a little bit about why you got involved in the case and how maybe this issue of you know, taking trains out of service played out in your experience.
Okay. Again, my name is Barry Simon, and I got involved with this because of how personally impacted I was. So just touching on the points that she brought up, for example, with the whole 1 hour thing, that was a selective enforcement discretionary thing on the part of the police. And it also had a lot to do with what time of the day and whether you were in, say, like a high profile locality of the subway system. So if you were, say, someplace where, like, say, like the E train at Spring Street at a non-busy time and they happen to see you, that wouldn't be the sort of thing that would want to make them, say, run you out or give you a hassle. Whereas if you were, say, on 14th Street be it the Union Square stop or the 8th Avenue stop, or if you were, say, at 34th Street, at 8th Avenue, or if you were, say, on 42nd Street during like the high profile times of the day, they would literally come through with a team of police, and they would sort of run the drill down on you like, are you waiting for a train? Why are you still here? As if they were watching you or something like that, when in fact they were conducting a sort of sweep, but not a sweep, because they really were targeting people who, in their opinion, were homeless people. So that speaks to that 1 hour thing. Now, just to sort of touch on the whole, your cart could only be but so long or so big, or that also was a sort of discretionary selective enforcement thing on the part of police, because if they didn't see you as one of the vendors on the train who sold things and who were just simply en route from one locality to another locality, then they decided to start asking you questions like, can you move your cart somewhere, or will you come out of the train with your cart and say go upstairs outside and just kind of get out of sight or out of being what they deem to be an eyesore during the high profile times of the train stations. So I say that to say that, say, if we were talking about, say, something like late at night, 1 o'clock, 12 o'clock, where people are pretty much desensitized about who was on the train, that wasn't a big deal to them to approach people like that. So a lot of these really big carts and whatever other hookup they had with it wasn't something that was flagged as much as it was, say, during the daytimes and during the high profile rush hour times on the trains and the various high profile locations like 42nd Street, 125th Street, any of these stops where like you have like a stream in the flow of people during the high profile times, where they would allege that your cart was obstructing 2 or 3 other seats or intimidating people from wanting to sit down. But I personally, in all of the time, which is like a day-to-day, night-to-night basis, being homeless on the trains, I never saw them measuring anyone's cart. I never heard them actually saying to someone, your cart is too big or too long. It was more of a thing of where they were profiling people based on a sort of discriminatory kind of standard. Like if you didn't look like you were like in a rush to go somewhere, or if you didn't look like you were about to on the train, then you were automatically deemed someone who had a cart that was making someone feel apprehensive about sitting out. And therefore, that was the basis for them saying to you, okay, well, you're going to have to leave the train station with your cart if if for no other time while that particular cop's or transit officer's tour was on. So let's just say it was the 8 to 4. They would tell you something like, you know what, I don't really care, just as long as like I don't have to see you again. It's no big deal to me. And that was pretty much like how the sweeps went as well. So if they were doing a sweep and their sergeant was walking with them and they had to approach you and they had to say something to you, they tell you, listen, like say like if you were like on 42nd Street where the Port Authority was. They tell you, you know what, why don't you just go upstairs in the Port Authority for a little while? We're going to be off in about another hour or two. I don't care as long as like I don't see you again. I don't have to say anything to you. And that goes to like the whole heart thing, but they never actually run around measuring people's cards or giving them some sort of feedback about the card per se itself, obstructing anything. Like you just fit a certain profile, you just fit a certain picture that they already had in their minds, in their thoughts about what they wanted to sort of clear. And lastly, as to the whole trains being put out of service, that was a really weird thing because in my experience, and that was like I said, every day and every night, they may have said that they were going to be taking the trains out of service, but anyone who was like really hardcore homeless on the trains knew that unless it was a high profile time of the day, that never happened. The train would stop. The cleaning crew people would get on the train. And unless you were someplace that was like a high profile stop, the train itself never actually was taken out of service. The only times that they did that was when they had some sort of standing order by their command, say with the E train, because the E train was pretty much like the train that most of the frequent homeless people would be on. What they would do is they would literally wait until the train got as far as, say, the Jamaica Center or the stop before the Jamaica Center, and they would just be like a whole team of police that would step on the train. And then basically, train being out of service was just long enough to get all of the homeless people out of the trains and try to route them upstairs out on the streets. And like I was saying with the other things before, they would literally tell you, you seem like a, not so much of a bad guy. Why don't you just go upstairs for a little while? We'll be disappearing in about an hour or two, then you can come back down and catch another train. Or they would tell you to catch another train. But during the times when they were alleging that they were taking trains out of service, they weren't really taking trains out of service. They were really just saying that as a sort of pretext and precursor to tell the people who didn't look like they were like ready to leave the train and go somewhere, okay, the train is out of service. They need to service the train. You have to get off the train. So in my experience and what I saw was that when you did get off the train, there were already people, maybe not a lot of people, but there were already people that were waiting because this was just before they did the whole 1 o'clock, the whole subway station shut down. So there were always people at these stops who were waiting for the trains to go back into service. The trains, until that thing where the mayor or the governor shut down the trains at 1 o'clock went into effect, the trains never really went out of service. That was just something for the police to step to anybody who was sleeping stretched out on the train or doing anything else undesirable on the train and get them off of the train and have the train crew people come and clean up the train. And then the people who were already on the platform waiting to take the train somewhere, they get on the train and then the train would pull off and resume service. So,
Thanks for that, Simon. Thank you.
Sure.
Alex, are we handing it back to you now? I think we are, right?
Yes, and I just want to thank you. I mean, that it was a lot of those, facts that you just talked about, Simon. I know that people can read sort of more some of those at least more in depth in the complaint, and I hope people will check that out in the Dropbox link that we're going to send. But it was really, thank you so much for sharing, your experience of those things with us, and we're going to go to some questions, but I hope you'll keep sharing your experience with us, and thank you, Marika, as well. So we have a few questions from the audience, but I'm just going to power trip a little as a moderator because there's some questions that I wanted to ask you all too. Oh, and Marcus, thank you so much for dropping that link. And I guess I will just say, because actually I'm going to take a pause here because we were going to end at 6:30. I think there's a desire to have some sort of back and forth discussion from folks. So what I'm going to say, I'm going to take a minute to just thank all of the panelists for being here. I wish that we could have given each of you your own panel for this amount of time, but I'm glad that we got sort of a taste of all the incredible work you're doing. I also hope everyone sort of checks out all these organizations, donates to them. I think you can donate to most of them online, finds other ways of getting involved. I think at least some of them have been, Marcus has sort of been plugging in the chat as we're going. So I encourage you to sort of reach out. And I'm just going to say, for anyone who can stay, we're going to kind of keep this Q&A going probably until 6:40, 6:45. But if anyone, including panelists, if you need to go, I just want to say, don't feel shy at this point. And a big thank you to everyone who's joined us from all over the country to listen and watch this. Thank you so much. And so, yeah, please, as Marcus just said in the chat, we open the chat up so you can just sort of freestyle put your questions in. But I am going to power trip and ask some questions myself, because you only get these opportunities like once or twice in your life, So, one thing that I'm curious that I'd love to hear from you all about is, as you were talking about all the different types of work you're doing on sort of the local level, the national level, one thing I was thinking about is sort of the solutions that we kind of choose to pursue to address a lot of these problems. And we heard from some of you about the strategies you're pursuing. But, I've just been thinking about how when we're talking about, mega sort of social, political, economic systems like mass homelessness and criminalization of homelessness, we know there's like a lot of other things that need to be addressed and abolished before we get to a world where these things don't exist. So we have kind of like these long-term goals of a world where homelessness isn't even something that could exist. But then we have to use these short-term goals along the way to get us there. And sort of while we're in that mix and we're fighting towards those long goals, which you all are doing, there's all these other solutions that pop up. Some of them are from unhoused people, poor people, low wealth people. Some of them are not. Some of them are coming from like the state or from the government, and people who are not only maybe not on board with those long-term visions, but like actively trying to keep the status quo. And then a lot of them might, start from the grassroots and get kind of muddled up. And end up in something that's like less liberatory. So I guess I'm wondering if you all could speak a little bit more to how you choose these sort of short-term steps that you're taking. Like, how do you personally or your organizations approach, avoiding these traps of co-option, or avoiding traps that sort of end us up in the same place over and over? How can we tell what's a good sort of short-term step or solution? And you can all just sort of, I'm just going to leave it to you to just jump in.
Well, that's the longest I've seen these guys stay quiet. Holy shit. I mean, I think the problem is when we call them victories. That's the issue. Like, if we ever buy into, I mean, the court system is so incremental. The legislative system is so freaking incremental that, and with the welfare reform fights I referenced earlier, they were calling a 12% cut instead of a 22% cut a victory. And that's where this isn't a campaign. This is about changing our structures. So there's going to be victories. There's going to be getting our asses kicked with the Right to Rest Act. Like, that stuff's going to happen. But are you going to get back up the next day and just keep going until we get to the prize at the end of the rainbow? Because this shit's incremental. That's not a victory.
I would just follow up on what Paul said. You know, when we filed the notice of claim with on behalf of Floyd and Jesus and Tim, you know, they had their property destroyed in that sweep on October 2nd, 2015, I believe it was. And they were leaders of Picture the Homeless, and it was what they went through was painful. And if we didn't have their back in that moment, we would have been assholes, you know? And so you have to weigh a lot of different things. But them stepping up and doing that, you know, really gave a lot of momentum to all the other folks that knew them. We generated a tremendous amount of press coverage about really the cruelty of it. And so it was a lot of work, a lot of support. They had to meet with the attorney, and it never would have happened if the attorney hadn't gotten the surveillance, the security camera footage. So there was a lot of different pieces to it. But I think you always have to start with, if you're any kind of organizing group, you have to start with what's going to make sure that you're having the back of the members of your group that are the ones that are at the center of the work. And if it's a situation where some people want to do something and other people don't want to do it, you talk through it. And we use this term reform for reform, or reform on the way to revolution. And so if there's stuff that we're going to get out of it on the way to revolution, it makes sense. But in that case, we had to have their back, or, you know, what's the point? And so that's a big part of it. The Community Safety Act, you know, with the ending the discretion of the police to be able to arrest, the Civil Liberties Union wanted to do a bill where they would start tracking, the state would have to track how many people got arrested for quality of life violations. And our members really pushed back, and they were like, it's too many. It's like the homeless count. It's too many. Like, we have a data fetish sometimes, or other people have a data fetish sometimes that we get sucked into. And so it was a learning curve for us to say, okay, we'll do this because it's going to give us ammunition. But we had built up enough trust with other folks within CPR that we knew that was going to happen, that there was going to be a bill that would end custodial arrests. And so it takes that as well. Like, you can't just make a strategic decision unless you really truly believe that the partners that you're doing that with actually are going to be for real and keep their word. And then that makes you keep your word. And so I used the term resistance relationships a couple of times, but that's also part of the calculation.
On the legal side, I think incremental work is something that you just have to be comfortable with. You know, you can only move the needle in small ways and usually very narrowly within the context of any case. How you prioritize really should be rooted in what do the people that you serve need and want? What are the remedies that they're seeking? And what are the legal strategies that are going to get you there? And, you know, so I guess lawyers have a luxury in some way, and that we can't and shouldn't be the ones setting the prioritization. That should all be people led. And that's what movement lawyering is all about. And to draw on something that Marika said, some of the most impactful cases are not necessarily going to be the ones that result in an order in your favor at the end of it. There's a lot that goes into a legal strategy, including how does this case, you know, get at a potential remedy, but also build other forms of power. How does this unify a movement? You know, how does this move the needle toward, you know, building greater equity in our society, moving us toward a human right to housing? You know, how does this address some of the fundamental issues that we're all here, you know, interested in and fighting for? And so, you know, that's another guiding principle that I think every legal practitioner hearing me now would be well served to keep at the front of their minds.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm gonna ask a question that we got from the audience, and then I'm gonna power trip on it as well and sort of just flesh it out a little bit more. But just before I do that, for everyone sort of listening in who's stuck around, thank you so much. And you know, we kind of meant to name earlier that itself and sort of this event is part of a movement that we're trying to do at CUNY to basically develop practical legal education that is able to be in support of movements that exist already of unhoused people in New York City. So this is sort of part of the sort of legal defense clinic project that Rap and Tristia, or mostly Tristia, talked about, but it's also just something that we know has to happen at CUNY, that CUNY is sort of well positioned to take on. So for those of you who might be watching this who are at CUNY, if you want to know more about getting involved in this, like, you can send us a chat to me or to Marcus Hyde, or just any contact you have, and I'll put my email in the chat after. But so the question from the chat was from John. And John, if you're still here, I can't see, but and you want to come in and sort of flesh this out, feel free to jump in. But John asked, Paul, it was actually while you were talking about the sort of general sort of, well, everything you were talking about. John asked, you know, why do we need a statute when, and I'm guessing what John meant by that was sort of the Right to Rest Act. Why do we need the Right to Rest Act, and why do we need these other sort of policy or, you know, legal victories when it should already be unconstitutional to do sweeps? So I feel like that's something that's worth fleshing out a little bit more. And, you know, Paul, if you want to speak to this, or anyone else, if you want to speak to this.
Yeah, I think the key word there was it should be unconstitutional. The key word is should. Yeah, it should be. We've been doing Know Your Rights pamphlets for freaking years. And the issue is we know what our rights are supposed to be, you know, and those are not being respected. And most of them are colonizing bullshit. But even that isn't being respected. And we also know from like Elisa Della Piana out here in San Francisco and others, you go in, you're getting caught up in the criminal justice system. When you're inside that system, you absolutely need a freaking lawyer. And that's why with homeless courts and all that shit, they're like, you have to plead guilty. What do you need a lawyer for? In order to enter the courtroom, you have to plead guilty. When people go in with legal representation, direct legal representation for chump change harassment bullshit, 90% of the time they get out. It gets dropped. Just because you stood up for yourself, like with the welfare reform, the people that got lawyers and appealed it, most of them kept their SSI checks. The ones that didn't, which was 90% of the people who were like, oh, the government's fucking me over again, I'm out of here. They didn't get anything. And they know that, the system knows that. If we can make the access really difficult, you're not even gonna fight the shit, you're just gonna walk away. And this is building power, so everybody feels entitled to be treated with dignity and respect. And you got to fight every fucking time they do this.